Hello everyone, I am Advait Kauta and welcome back to another episode of Class 8 Social Studies. Today we'll be starting the first chapter in Civics, that is the Indian Constitution. So let's have an overview of this chapter first. This is what we'll be looking at. The chapter is divided into two halves. The first is the purpose of a generic constitution and the second is the key features of the Indian Constitution. In the purposes of a constitution, we'll be looking at three purposes. The first is the ideals it lays down, the second is the guidelines that it provides, and the third is how it protects us from ourselves. Next, we'll be looking at the key features of the Indian Constitution, which are these five. So, without further ado, let's begin, shall we? So first, talking about the ideals a constitution lays down. Firstly, what is an ideal? An ideal is the purest form of any philosophy, which is put into words. So, there are certain sets of philosophies and ideals that the people within a country want to agree upon. They want their country to be run according to those ideals. And that is exactly what the Constitution does. It acts as that one document upon which all people in a certain country can agree upon the ideals of it. So, let me give you an example of what I mean by these ideals. So, when any country is converted from a monarchy to, let's say, a republic, a democratic republic, obviously its constitution changes, right? Why does it change? It changes because when it was in the form of a monarchy, it had different ideals where the people did not have rights and the king had the sole power to rule. Whereas when they now turn into a democratic republic, they are sovereign, meaning they are not ruled by any foreign body, and that the people have all the rights over the decisions taken in the country. So, because of the contrast between these two ideals, there is the necessity for a new constitution to be formed. Such was the case of Nepal. In the year 1990, Nepal for the first time achieved its independence. However, its king, King Jnanendra, began taking over various aspects of the government, citing a Maoist uprising. Now, what is Maoist? It is a form of communism which was started by the Chinese leader Mao Zedong. So, it's a form of communism. So, citing this uprising of communism as a reason, King Jnanendra began taking over various roles in the government. By 2002, he had a lot of power, and by 2005, he completely took over the entire democratic parliament, meaning that the parliament was just symbolic and that the king finally got back his power. This led to major uprisings in the country, and in 2006, there was a massive people's movement for democracy. In 2008, this democracy was finally achieved, and in 2015, Nepal finally wrote its first ever democratic constitution. Now, question: why did Nepal rewrite its constitution? It rewrote its constitution because its new form of democracy did not agree with the ideals of its primitive monarchy. And so the rules within the country had to be changed. Just as within a sport, let's say, when the fundamental nature of the sport is changed, obviously all the rules change. For example, tomorrow I say, in football, it's legal to use your hands to deflect the ball. That changes the basic structure of the very game, and so many other rules within the game itself have to be changed. And because of this, different aspects or ideals are changed, and so is the constitution. So these are the ideals that a constitution lays down for a country. The second purpose that I mentioned was guidelines. When we talk about these guidelines, they are of two types. First is preventing the domination of democratically elected leaders, and the second is preventing the domination of various groups over other groups within the country. So, when we talk about the dominance of power by the leaders within a country. Let's take an example. Let's say your class has a class monitor, and tomorrow they decide that they suddenly have a personal grudge on you. They attempt to take all of that out on you and complain something absolutely ridiculous about you to the teacher. But you cannot do anything because you are not in the powerful position of that class monitor. So it was just a very basic example to show you how misuse of power and dominance can happen within a democratic society. As we saw in this classroom incident, which I just explained, something similar can happen within a democracy. Leaders who are in a higher and more powerful position can often exploit this power. The constitution makes sure that this exploitation of power does not happen. In the Indian constitution, for example, we have the distribution of power between the three organs of the government, that is the executive, legislature, and the judiciary, something that we'll study in the next half of this chapter. Now, the second type of guidelines that the constitution sets is against the domination of one group by another. Often in a country, there are minority groups and there are majority groups. The constitution makes sure that these majority groups do not dominate the minority groups. Now, why will these majority groups even try to dominate? Well, it's the fundamental nature of a democracy. The party which secures the most votes wins, right? Which means that the party which is in majority wins, which means that a majority of the people have voted for that political party. This means that the majority which is in that country always holds the power. But the constitution makes sure that this majority does not exercise all of this superficial power on the minorities, in spite of the fact that they are larger in number. So, those are the two types of guidelines that the constitution of a country sets. Now, finally, the most interesting point of all is the fact that it protects us from ourselves. Now, what do I mean by that? So, let's take an example. Say you have an exam tomorrow. Now, you want to prepare really hard for it and you want to get really good marks in it. But then you have your favorite TV show that your parents are watching. Now, what will you do? Will you watch that TV show or will you prepare for the exam? Now, if you watch that TV show, you're basically retiring for a short term happiness. That is, you'll watch the TV show for gaining happiness and pleasure in that temporary period of time. But in the longer run, when you're writing the exam, because of your lack of preparation, you might write it extremely horribly. On the other hand, if you prepare for the exam, you're securing long term happiness. That is, for a prolonged period of time, you'll be happy. Why? Because you performed excellent in that exam. So, something like this can happen in democratic societies. Democracy is such a fragile and new idea that it often can be hard to cope with its radical nature, or may I say, the lack of radicalism, even. It's hard to cope with that, and hence, few people or few groups might resort to choosing a more radical approach to governance by choosing something like a communism or a dictatorship. But the constitution makes sure that the principles of a democracy are not violated. They're not violated so that these dictatorships and communist forms of rule do not come into play in the future, which might affect the people. Now, why might these even affect the people? Because you see, in democracy, returns are not short term. As we saw with the example of the TV show, your pleasure back then was short term. Such is the case with conservative dictatorships. You'll have returns in the short term, but in the long run, you're not receiving fundamental rights, nor are you receiving the power that the people in a country are supposed to hold. Whereas in a democracy, you might not receive short term returns, but in the long run, you will be happy. And so, in that case, the constitution is protecting us from ourselves and is protecting us from taking any sort of radical decisions. Now, let's talk about the key features of the Indian constitution. Before that, let's understand why the constitution has so much of a significance in India and why it has so many great measures and features. Well, the first fact that you have to consider is that this country was born after a partition between India and Pakistan. This caused a lot of chaos in the country, resulting to a death rate of over 10 lakh. And so the country was pretty much in a disturbed state. And hence, enforcing law and order was extremely important. How was the Constituent Assembly going to make sure that all of this happened? They had to prepare the finest constitution that the world had ever seen, the most democratic and the best constitution in the world. And that is exactly what they did. The next problem is that the citizens of the country were slowly emerging from the status of subjects to that of democratic people. Because earlier, when we were under British rule, we were being subjected to do a lot of things that we didn't like, but we were slowly evolving into becoming a part of a democratic society. To make this transition as joyful and as smooth as possible, the constitution had to be perfect. And because of these, there is so much of a significance to the making of the Indian constitution, and hence it has so many key features. So, the first of these key features that we'll be looking at is the concept of federalism. Now, what do we mean by federalism? It is a concept wherein there are different levels of the government. So, in India, for example, we have the union government, which has the most power in the country. Next, we have the state government, which has the power within its state. And then we have the Gram Panchayat, which has power within its village. This is because there has to be a distribution of power within a democratic society to ensure efficient progress. Because you see, most democracies are representative. That is, the people do not directly go there to the parliament building, sit there and discuss. No. We elect people to represent us. And so, if we have more number of people representing us, it means we have more of a choice to choose. And so, because of that, we can ensure efficiency within a society. All of this makes this feature extremely important because the three levels of governance ensure that the thoughts of all people's groups are put into lawmaking. So that is the first concept of federalism, wherein there are three divisions within the Indian governance: the union government, the state government, and finally the Gram Panchayat. The next thing we'll be talking about is an idea borrowed from the British system of governance, that is, a parliamentary form of governance. In India, we have two houses or two levels within the parliament: the Lok Sabha, which has more power in lawmaking, and the Rajya Sabha, which acts as a reviewing person within the system. Now, this parliamentary form of government ensures that there are representatives of the people while making laws. The Lok Sabha makes all of these laws and consists of completely elected people. We'll be talking more about the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha in a future chapter. But to give you an overview, there are elected people in the Lok Sabha. Whereas in the Rajya Sabha, a majority is elected by the legislative assembly members and 12 people are chosen by the president of the government. Next, we have another form of parliament which is unique to India. No other country has this, and it is called the Legislative Assembly. Now, the parliament is at the union level, at the highest level, at the level of the country. Whereas for the states, there is the Legislative Assembly. Now, when we were talking about the Rajya Sabha, I told you that most of the people over there are elected by the members of the Legislative Assembly. Whereas these Legislative Assembly members in return are elected by the people. So there is so much of an election and representative process here that the ideas of the people can finally be put into force while making the laws. And so that is the concept of the parliamentary form of government, which is borrowed from the British system, wherein you have a parliament which consists of elected representatives of the people. Next, we'll be talking about the separation of powers. Now, this is an idea borrowed from the country France during the French Revolution, which will be taught in ninth grade to all of you. But to give you an overview of what happened there, the king basically was demoted. The king basically had to abdicate or give up on his power. Why did it happen? Because the king himself, just one person, could not manage all of the affairs within the country. And that was the essence, the philosophy of the outcome of the revolution. The French Revolution told people that one person or one entity was not enough to manage all of the problems within a country. Instead, there should be three divisions of power within a country, all of them with different responsibilities. These are the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. So, what do these three do? Well, first, the legislative is basically the parliament, the body that prepares the laws. Next is the executive. The executive is the body that executes, that puts all of these laws into force and makes sure that no one breaks these laws. It is usually the government of the country. Next, when we talk about the judiciary, it is perhaps the aspect that keeps the other two in place. Their job is of enforcing the law and of making sure that the new laws that will be passed are within the limits set by the constitution. So that is the concept of the separation of powers. Now, in this separation of powers, why is it made? Well, the first thing that we looked at was that one person or one entity cannot handle all the affairs within a country. The second concept is that each of these organs of the government keeps a check and a balance on each other. It balances out each other's power while checking the other's power. For example, the judiciary makes sure that the members of the legislative do not break the law. And that way, it maintains a check. It also maintains a balance by making sure that the new laws passed by the legislative are within the limits set by the constitution. And hence, the three of them maintain checks and balances between each other. So that is the concept of separation of powers. Let's talk about the most important aspect of a democratic constitution: fundamental rights. Fundamental rights are the basic rights that every person in a country has. These are usually humanitarian rights that every person deserves, regardless of where they are from. In India, there are 6 of these fundamental rights. They are as following. All of these rights make sure that all the people in the country enjoy equal amounts of freedom, and that the government does not take away any of these rights for them. Now, the fundamental rights in the Indian Constitution are so well guarded that if tomorrow one of these fundamental rights of yours is violated, then you can directly approach the High Court or the Supreme Court, which are the two most powerful bodies within the Indian judiciary. So that is how well guarded the fundamental rights in our country are. And that is the concept of fundamental rights or basic rights. And the final concept and the final aspect of the Indian Constitution is of secularism. Secularism is a concept wherein the state, as I mentioned earlier, the combination of the three organs, does not follow any particular religion. Now, what do I mean by that? By this, basic things like portraits within a police station or a government building, let's say, they should not be of the gods of any religion. They should not be religious. Instead, when you look at our country, for example, we have the portraits of freedom fighters in police stations and other government buildings. And that is the concept of secularism, where the state does not officially promote any religion. But this is where we have to keep in mind one thing, that a party, but this is where we have to keep something in mind, that a political party which is in power can endorse a religion, but neither the government nor the state can. Only political parties can, because they have their specific party ideologies. So with that, we have concluded our lesson on the Indian Constitution. Next up, we will be continuing the topic of secularism, taking a deep dive into how we achieve secularism in India and how it is different from the secularism of other countries. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you in the next one. If you enjoyed the video, then please make sure you like the video, and if you know someone who's interested in content like this, then please make sure to share it as well. If you're new to the channel, then please make sure that you're subscribed and that you click the bell icon, and I'll see you in the next one.